Thank you, Jerry. Good morning. It is indeed an honor to be here at the annual Farmers Conference. I was here in December at the Professional Ag Workers Conference, and it's always a great joy to be at Tuskegee University and to share information. I can recall, how many of you were at the PAWC conference? Awesome. At that conference, we had an opportunity to talk a little bit about what we anticipated being in the Farm Bill this year, and there was an excitement and a buzz in the room. And one of the things I said to that audience that morning was, the Farm Bill is like our report card every 5 years. How are we really doing? And so shortly after the conference, we were able to confirm that the Farm Bill became law, and we were able to check our progress. How are we really doing? And the Farm Bill, because it is such a great piece of legislation, covers many different topics. And as Jerry said, one of the things that we have done as a Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Tuskegee University, is to collaborate on coming up with recommendations. So during the 5-year period preceding the bill, that would allow us to make the greatest gains for the Black farmers and communities of color that we serve. One of the things we knew going into this particular Farm Bill process was that this wasn't going to be a revolutionary Farm Bill. We had heard that in all likelihood, it was going to be more of an evolutionary Farm Bill. And so strategically thinking about how we could make gains, dealing with the pressure of the administration on, or the pushback on certain provisions that would require additional funding, we really strategized about what we wanted to focus in on from a policy standpoint. So what I want to talk about today is simply the highlights from some of those gains from this Farm Bill. Overall, the Farm Bill process was much of what we expected. There were some gains, certainly, and we feel like in terms of making the progress we wanted to see on equity and inclusion, we have some things to truly celebrate there. No Farm Bill is ever perfect. So obviously there is more work to be done. Next week I am scheduled to be in Washington, D.C. for the USDA Farm Bill listening session. And we are preparing comments on several of the provisions that you have in front of you on how those provisions or programs should be implemented in the Farm Bill. Because as you know, the Farm Bill is a 2- or 3-step process. Once we have the legislation, we now have to work towards implementation. And much of what goes into the Farm Bill is done during the rulemaking process. So the agency is going to be looking at how to implement this Farm Bill. And as I like to say, the proof is really in the pudding. So the implementation phase is where the rubber is going to meet the road, and I know that we have a number of agency people here in the audience today, and there is some reluctance to probably speak about how the agency is actually going to implement some of the legislation that is in the Farm Bill, and we certainly understand that, and that process is going to kind of play out over the next few weeks or months. But we intend to be a part of that process because we've gotten this far with some of the provisions that I'll talk about here in just a second. We certainly want to continue to follow through in the implementation phase to be sure that we're able to assist the agency in implementing these provisions. So a lot has been said this year about the Farm Bill and its game-changing provisions around equity and inclusion. We think the crown jewel of the legislation this year, and you have the handout in front of you, is focused around the attention on heirs property and the fact that heirs property owners have had a history of challenges when it comes to accessing USDA resources. In order for us to increase the number of African American farmers, one of the things that we have to do, and landowners, we have to ensure that those farmers and landowners have access to USDA programs. But the reality is that 60% of the land owned in African American communities, farmland especially, is heirs property. That creates a huge challenge for African American farmers and communities of color. So the Federation of Southern Cooperatives has done quite a bit of work around studying and working with heirs property owners, and we recognize that one of the policies that we needed to try to get into this farm bill was a policy recognizing that heirs property owners don't typically have the ability to show proof of clear title, because heirs property by its very definition means that a person is a co-tenant or co-owner with other family members. And those family members may be 5 or they may be 25, a group of 25. So when they go into a USDA office, the challenge when they try to qualify for a program is to show that they have ownership or control over that farm. The 2018 Farm Bill now includes a provision to allow these heirs property owners to get a farm number, farm and tract number, and to become eligible to farm on heirs property. It provides authority for the heirs property owners to try to start to resolve some of their heirs property issues. Now, what does that really mean? Well, oftentimes we can resolve some of the heirs property issues by doing things such as intra-family buyouts. The Federation has a history of working with families to facilitate such intra-family buyouts. The biggest problem or the biggest challenge has been the lack of resources among the family members to be able to buy each other out. The 2018 Farm Bill now creates a loan program which would allow heirs to access funds to resolve some of those heirs property issues. Now, another thing that we think is going to be very important is that in addition to qualifying for programs, the USDA requires documentation. What forms of documentation are typically available? Well, that's been kind of a question of depends on what state you're in. What we sought in this Farm Bill was an opportunity to create a broader number of documents that would be acceptable in those USDA offices for various heirs. And that language was included in the Farm Bill. It identifies some of the alternate forms of documentation that each state may use as control, as evidence of control in a state. And we particularly drew attention to the states that have passed the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, as that act creates some standard language for which heirs may be eligible. This area of the Farm Bill also includes research for more intensive studies on land tenure, and it allows the Secretary to collect data and perform analysis on farm ownership trends and operation. Many of the people who research in this area, black farm land ownership, there's no real way to determine how much land is actually heirs property. There have been some studies done on a state-by-state basis, sometimes on a regional type basis, but there's been no comprehensive study on how much land out there is actually heirs property. So the 2018 Farm Bill, I think in conjunction with the NASS agency, is going to allow the USDA to do more comprehensive research around those trends and then provide policymakers and others the opportunity to address some of those areas. I want to move on now to the area of mediation. Mediation is of particular importance because it allows farmers and producers to seek mediation as a part of their administrative appeals process. So if you receive an adverse letter from the USDA, say for a loan program, you are able to appeal that decision. And as a part of that appeals process, you have options. One of those options is mediation. Now, I like to kind of discuss mediation with heirs property because I think these two things can go hand in hand, particularly since the vision that we have is mediation before the 2018 Farm Bill only covered adverse decisions coming from the USDA agencies. We advocated that mediation should be expanded to include topics such as leases, farm transitions, organic certification issues, farmer-neighbor conflicts. And so the 2018 Farm Bill has expanded the number of covered cases for mediation. That's particularly beneficial to the states that have a certified USDA program. And the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, I head up our mediation programs in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia. So we have seen certainly an uptick in the number of people accessing those programs, and we believe it's going to be particularly helpful as it relates to resolving heirs property issues and just sitting down with families, talking through the issues that may be present, and this will be at no cost to the families in a certified USDA state. Let me move now to outreach and technical assistance. As many of you know, since 1990, when the Farm Bill provided for what is known today as the 2501 program, that program focused specifically on providing technical assistance to socially disadvantaged farmers. It has certainly evolved over the years, but one of its shortcomings has been the lack of permanent funding that would keep that program in the Farm Bill for the entire duration of the Farm Bill, and oftentimes the program funds would run out before the Farm Bill cycle was over. That became very problematic for many of the land-grant universities that use those funds, community-based organizations. So what we looked at was an opportunity to create some full baseline funding, permanent funding for the 2501 program. And one of the strategies we saw was combining that program with the Beginning Farmer and Development Rancher program so that there was a $50 million baseline created. And that's not going to happen until like 2023. But with the combination of those two programs, the 2501 program essentially and the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development program, they now combine to become what is known as the Farming Opportunities Training and Outreach Program. And that program will provide for $435 million in mandatory funding for photo over the next 10 years. That is a considerable gain considering that now that we have the permanent funding, that will allow us to not have the uncertainty that is usually in the 2501 program. So again, implementation is everything. We will have to still work on just how those two programs work together and what that really means, and ensure that we don't compromise anything in that process. Let me move on now to credit. This Farm Bill talks a lot about credit, and we were able to really work on some specific things, not as many gains for us under the credit title. There was a lot of attention around increasing loan limits this time, and I think a lot of that came from your banking lobbyist, quite frankly. But what we did see this time was an increase in direct farm ownership loans. They went up to $600,000. Your operating loans went up to $400,000. The guaranteed loans actually went up to $1.75 million. So these are gains, certainly recognizing the difficulty in farming these days. I think it gives our farmers an opportunity to access greater resources. But the question that I often get from farmers when I'm speaking around the country is, why is it important, or essentially, what's the purpose of increasing the loan limits if African American farmers still have a lot of trouble getting the loans? So it really doesn't matter how high the loan limits are if African American farmers still don't qualify to get a lot of those loans. And I think that's a very valid question and concern. So that's something that we have to continue to look at. On the lending side, there is increased public reporting on lending trends, and I think this is important because it will give us some feedback on who's getting these loans. Are beginning or socially disadvantaged farmers getting a fair shake at the loans which are available? And if not, what are the challenges to these farmers not being qualified to get loans? Because as many of you are in this room, technical service providers, we want to ensure that the farmers have the best opportunity to access loans to make their farms as viable as possible. I think clearly one of the biggest areas of gain for our farmers, our HBCUs, our communities, was in the area of education. The Farm Bill provides $80 million in new funding for new land-grant HBCU student scholarships, and I think that's $40 million mandatory and $40 million discretionary. And so that's going to create an opportunity for us to attract students in the area of agriculture and create a pipeline for new student leaders in the area of agriculture. There was $10 million put in the Farm Bill to support 3 new HBCU centers of excellence to address the agricultural workforce development, nutrition and food security, economic development, and emerging technologies. The location of the 3 centers is going to be determined by a competitive grant process through the USDA. But again, with that program having the minimum of $10 million, that creates permanent funding for that program. One of the other gains for the education and HBCU community was $15 million in HBCU cooperative extension and research. And the Farm Bill also now allows 1890s to carry over 100% of unused funds. Previously, many of you may already know, HBCUs could only carry over 20% of their extension funding if it wasn't used in a calendar year. So this funding helps to address public needs, and it helps to strengthen HBCUs. There was a transparency requirement put into this Farm Bill States are now required to report to Congress how much funding they're providing to both their 1890 land grant and to their 1860 land grants. In the area of marketing, and I know Ben, this is near and dear to his heart as a farmer, will probably talk a little bit more about some of the producer marketing programs and some of those programs which impact cooperatives. But in the Farm Bill, we do have the Local Agricultural Market Program, which is called LAMP, which provides $50 million per year in mandatory permanent funding. And that's going to increase the access to markets. We're really excited about that. And LAMP combines what was the Farmers Market and Local Food Promotion Program and the Value Added Producer Grant Program together to provide baseline funding. Okay, and the last area I want to touch on is conservation. One of the programs our farmers have used quite heavily is the EQIP program, and that has been very successful for many of our farmers. And so one of the things that the 2018 Farm Bill does is it ensures that all beginning and socially disadvantaged farmers enrolling in EQIP have the option to receive 50% of their cost share payment up front. This is going to be very important, particularly for limited resource farmers. Getting that upfront payment allows them to start implementing conservation practices at a faster rate, and it ensures that they're going to be a little bit more successful with those practices. So I'm going to stop right there with this overview. I'm sure that we can dialogue a little bit more with some questions, but I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Ben Burkett.